Hello, I'm Bob Trubshaw. I'd like to talk to you today about something I knew almost nothing about a couple of months ago, and, to all intents and purposes, neither did anyone else. So, allow me to share some very new insights. So I'd like to talk to you today about the earliest churches in Nottinghamshire, which means the ones founded in the 7th or 8th centuries, which is long before the majority of what we now call parish churches were even constructed, because most parish churches originate as manorial chapels in the late 10th or 11th centuries. Establishing which churches in England are the earliest is usually difficult, in large part because of the lack of surviving contemporary documents. And very few historians look at the available evidence and attempt to, as it were, peel away the later layers of developments to reveal what might have been going on in the 7th and 8th centuries. Contemporary records just didn't survive the Scandinavian settlement in the 9th and 10th centuries. Much has to be made of records of dependent chapels and landholdings written down from the 13th to the 18th centuries. So churches which once had a substantial number of dependent churches or chapels are often, although not always, the oldest. I will use the term mother church to refer to churches with an unusual number of daughter dependencies. So, in October 2023, when I was looking for something else, I came across the East Midlands Historic Environment Research Framework, compiled by Alan Vince. The document is undated, but probably about 2008, because Vince himself died in 2009. Now, Vince's research framework is the successor to a previous East Midlands Historic Environment Research Framework, published in 2000, where an archaeological resource assessment of Anglo-Saxon Nottinghamshire was compiled by Mike Bishop, who, at that time, was county archaeologist for Nottinghamshire. Mike Bishop considered that 11 churches are plausibly 7th or 8th century foundations: Misterton, Dunham, Edwinstowe, Mansfield, Kirkby and Ashfield, Southwell, East Stoke, Austin, Flawford, Ratcliffe-on-Soar, and Stanford-on-Soar. But this doesn't mean that these 11 places are of equal status. Nearly half may have started out as chapels rather than full-blown mother churches. And some of these early churches might not be quite as early as the others, because the very earliest ones may have had quite a short life before being relocated to a nearby, presumably more advantageous location. So, for example, Flawford, Kirkby and Ashfield, Misterton and Stanford-on-Soar may have all lost their initial status, although the church building continued to exist as a place of worship. Now, links between the earliest churches could be over surprising distances, and sustained over many centuries. For example, in 1093, William Rufus, or William II, gave to one Robert Blowett, the newly appointed Bishop of Lincoln, the churches of Mansfield and Austin, with the chapels belonging to these manors. Edwinstowe was one of these chapelries. We have to assume that this close connection had arisen when these churches were founded in the 7th century. And the connection between Mansfield, Edwinstowe and Austin was maintained until the 19th century. Let's look at a little more detail at these 11 candidates for early churches. Edwinstowe is the one which most obviously suggests a 7th century origin. It is the stowe, or sacred place, of Edwin, and this suggests the church was founded soon after the death of Edwin in a nearby battle on the 12th of October, 632. And this is kind of confirmed by the meticulous research of Andy Gaunt, who established that Edwinstowe Church would have aligned with sunrise on the 12th of October in the 7th century. However, precession and calendrical changes mean this alignment is no longer accurate. The place name Kirkby and Ashfield also indicates that the settlement had a church, a kirk, at the time of the Scandinavian settlement in the late 9th, early 10th century. Clearly such churches predate the later 10th and 11th century fashion for the manorial chapels, which become most of the English parish churches, but the name Kirkby doesn't provide any evidence as to whether the kirk was, or was not, one of the earliest churches. The church is situated on a ridge overlooking the upper reaches of the Erewash Valley. It also overlooks the boundary between Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, and it's also the western boundary of the ancient forest of Sherwood. The dedication is to St Wilfrid, who lived between 634 and 709. He's best remembered as persuading the churches of northern England to move from British to Roman Christianity. And while there is no evidence of his involvement with Kirkby and Ashfield, it does add weight to the notion that this church was founded in the early 8th century. On the face of things, Misterton denotes a settlement, Old English tun, with an early church, Old English minster. But this may be misleading. The settlement may instead be generating revenue to support a nearby church. Several examples of Preston in England suggest settlements intended to support a priest, but the priest seemingly didn't live there. In the case of this Misterton, the possible location for the priest and an early church is Clarborough, about 8 miles to the south. But other than Clarborough later being a mother church, there's actually nothing to suggest it's one of the earliest churches. Misterton, situated on higher ground adjacent to the River Trent and to the boundary with Lincolnshire and the Isle of Oxholm. Now, a one-time river crossing is suggested by the nearby villages of West and East Stockworth. They straddle the Trent, and the minor roads going through these villages are aligned, suggesting there was some sort of crossing. Just to confuse you, the With part of the Stockworth does not derive from Old Scandinavian wath, which means ford, as you might expect, because the earliest forms of the name are Stockhythe, so from the Old English hythe, landing place. And, in case you're wondering, in Old English stock was a large piece of timber. So 2 substantial timber landing stages indicate at the very least a ferry, and plausibly a trading place too. Possibly, Misterton Church originated as a shrine associated with the crossing of the Trent, so if you like, a precursor to later medieval bridge chapels. At Alston, the Domesday Survey of 1086 records that there was a church and 2 priests. Alston was linked to several surrounding parishes, so was the administrative centre of a royal estate. Even as late as the 18th century, the church at Alston was renting out substantial amounts of land in these surrounding parishes. By the 12th century, the nearby settlements at Bingham and Bottisford were bigger and more valuable than Alston. Alston seemed to suffer from being piggy in the middle, and did not grow in the same way as its 2 neighbours. Over in Southall, in the late 18th century, the pioneering archaeologist Hayman Brooke discovered evidence for a Roman villa adjacent to the Minster Church, and this was confirmed in 1959 by the excavation of a Roman building to the immediate east of the Minster. Now, early churches on the site of Roman villas are not unusual. They suggest that the church took over the land unit associated with the villa, which in turn may have taken over a land unit established in or before the Iron Age. The reuse and presumed refurbishment, such as re-roofing, of Roman buildings as early churches is plausible, although the main archaeological evidence for the reuse of Roman buildings seemed to be purely domestic. According to legend, the earliest church at Southall is believed to have been founded in 627 by Paulinus, the first Archbishop of York. Only from the mid-10th century was the church referred to as a minster, which indicated it was a collegiate body of theological learning. Southall's development into a minster led to the extensive rebuilding of the church in the 12th century, much of which is still visible today. Dunham-on-Trent is located on the Lincoln to Worksop Road, now the A57, about half a mile to the west of a toll bridge over the Trent. The early forms of the place name indicate it was the harm, or settlement, on the hill, Old English Don. The church is dedicated to Oswald of Northumbria, who was born about 604 and died in either 641 or 642. He was king of Northumbria from 634 until his death, which was during the Battle of Maserfield, while fighting the forces of Penda of Mercia. The site of that battle is traditionally identified with Oswestry, which originally was Oswald's tree. Why Dunham became associated with St Oswald is unknown, but the dedication strongly infers a foundation in the 1640s or soon after. Dunham Church is close to the river and not on any sort of hill, so presumably was remote from the main settlement on the eponymous hill. Having a church so close to a river prone to major floods is unusual, and indeed it led to the church needing to be rebuilt in the early 18th century. The route from Lincoln to Worksop crossed the Trent by ferry until 1832, when the first bridge at Dunham was constructed. To me it seems most probable that Dunham Church originated as a shrine associated with a tricky crossing of the Trent. Now, several other of the earliest churches in Nottinghamshire are at river crossings. First, well, let's forget Flawford. It's not on a ford. The modern name is a corruption of Flawforth. It isn't anywhere near even a minor watercourse. The Flaw part of the name is indeed Flaw, almost certainly referring to a Roman mosaic pavement, and archaeologists discovered Roman walls, although not any mosaics, underneath the remains of a church demolished in the late 18th century. East Stoke, on the south side of the Trent, may have been the site of a Roman settlement called Ad Pontem, which means at the bridge, although this is disputed. But there was certainly a bridge there, as the Foss Way crosses the River Devon, right where the Devon joins the Trent. East Stoke parish was once much bigger, as all the land where Newark-on-Trent is now situated was carved out of the original parish of East Stoke. Significantly, East Stoke Church is dedicated to St Oswald, same as the church at Dunham. Stanford-on-Soar was indeed where there was once a stony ford across the River Soar, and quite likely Ratcliffe-on-Soar once had a ferry. And to the immediate west of Alston Church, the road crosses the River Smite. I don't think this link between early churches and river crossings is any coincidence. Firstly, there are clear pre-conversion precursors for shrines at river crossings. In a previous video I've looked at these, so just a quick recap. In Nottinghamshire there's Stapleford, in North Leicestershire is another Stapleford, and Wyfordby, both on the River Eye east of Melton Mowbray. There are other Staplefords and Weefords in other counties too. These all take their names from Old English Stapo and Weo, also written Wee, both denoting pagan shrines or idols. That such sites evolved into early Christian shrines is confirmed by Christian Mulford in Wiltshire. This place name originates as the Old English Christmel Ford, the Christmark Ford or Cross Ford. The church sits right by the bank of the Wiltshire Avon at a location suitable for a ford. Furthermore, in both Leicestershire and Wiltshire, the earliest churches are mostly situated at river crossings, close to the probable limits of navigation for small vessels. In yet another video, I looked at the way early churches are clearly linked to waterborne trade. My interest in these earliest churches of Nottinghamshire was triggered by Dunham and Alston, as neither parish seems that significant in recent centuries. However, I was aware that Alston's valuation in 1086 made it an important parish in the local area, along with Bingham and Bottisford. Significantly, it was held directly by the king, and as Mike Bishop and Alan Vince note, this infers a long-established royal estate centre. Dunham and Mansfield were also held by the king, as was part of Misterton. Are these royal estates successors to Roman estates? Well, the honest answer is always going to be possibly, possibly not. But the early churches at Flawford, Southwell, Stanford-on-Soar are all associated with Roman occupation sites, plausibly the villas functioning as estate centres, while a church at the Roman small town of Vernameaton, right on the Nottinghamshire-Leicestershire border, was on the edge of the Roman town. So it's possible that the parochia of other earliest churches had roughly the same boundaries as Roman estates, which themselves plausibly retained Iron Age or earlier boundaries. One aspect of earliest churches at royal estate centres which clearly correlates is their location at places suitable for waterborne transport and trade. This fits well with the earliest churches in Leicestershire, Wiltshire, the Thames Valley, and along the south coast in Dorset and Sussex. Anglo-Saxon settlers arrived in England from the continent by boat. Some of them were no doubt continuing to travel across the North Sea for trade and other reasons. There would have been a substantial number of craft available, and these would also have been suitable for continuing their journeys along the more major inland rivers. So little surprise that Dunham-on-Trent, East Stoke, Ratcliffe-on-Soar, Stanford-on-Soar all occupy places where boats could be beached, while Misterton is close to West Stockwith with its eponymous timber landing stage. My own evaluation of the evidence for earliest churches along the south coast indicated that they were located where boats could be beached, such as Bosham, or where a tributary branched off a fast-flowing tidal estuary, such as Beddingham. This strongly suggests that waterborne trade was essential to the earliest churches. This would be entirely consistent with the need to bring in supplies, such as incense, herbal remedies such as opium, liturgical garments and vessels and so forth, and to disperse any excesses of agricultural produce. As discussed in my video on the Anglo-Saxon cemetery near Willoughby on the Wolds, archaeological evidence suggests that the Roman road network was not in use around the 6th and 7th centuries, because at that Willoughby cemetery some of the Anglo-Saxon burials were either on or in the Roman road surface. And so when, about 10 years ago, I started to compare the locations of the earliest churches in Leicestershire with those in Wiltshire, I was surprised, as it doesn't seem to have been picked up by other researchers, that most of the earliest churches are at the limit of navigation for small watercraft. These are also locations where the watercourse can be forded. Forwards are places where flat-bottom boats can be beached. This arrangement is so consistent in Leicestershire and Wiltshire that there was one earliest church for every river headwater, and only one church for every such headwater. If you want more details, see my previous video on early churches and waterborne trade. Now, my idea of the limits of navigation is not about substantial vessels. Even a few logs tied together and punted along a minor watercourse would be capable of carrying between 1/2 and 1 ton of produce in a manner much easier and cheaper than overland options. Presumably the construction will be more sophisticated and broadly similar to the punts still conveying tourists on the Cam at Cambridge. I think of them as the Anglo-Saxon counterpart to the ubiquitous 1-ton flatbeds on modern roads. If you think this is a little unlikely, then this modern canoeist happened to launch his canoe at Luffinham in Rutland, where there was once an early church, and proceeded downstream towards the confluence with the Welland. He didn't know it, but he passed the site of the riverside Roman villa, which was almost certainly the precursor to the parochia of the minster at Luffinham. The link to his website is below. Now, small vessels would not be able to cope with the currents on the Trent or other major watercourses, so transferring goods and passengers to larger vessels, presumably fitted with sails, would be necessary near the confluences. In the 6th and 7th centuries, the locations of settlement seems to prefer riverside locations. Seemingly there was little or no interest in overland routes. The previous video, called Always Upstream, Never Downstream, I describe how early churches relocated in the 8th century to places where rivers were crossed by prehistoric or Roman roads. Examples include Foxley moving to Malmesbury in Wiltshire, also Oldby moving to Leicester, which is where the Fossway crosses the River Soar, and Kirby Bellers to Melton Mowbray, where a prehistoric north-south trackway crosses the River Reek or the River Eye. These suggest a revived interest in roads during the later 8th century, and by extension strongly implies little interest in roads previously when the waterways had been the principal means of transport. And the earliest churches in Nottinghamshire fit the same pattern as Leicestershire and Wiltshire. And why do I say that? Well, Edwinstowe and Mansfield are both near the River Mourne. The Mourne flows for a considerable distance to the north-east, changing its name to the River Idle along the way. The confluence with the Idle and the Trent is at West Stockwith, close to Misterton. Plausibly, the Mourne was once navigable to small craft as far as Edwinstowe and Mansfield. As already noted, Austin Church is situated close to the eastern bank of the River Smite, with the OS map of 1884 showing a relict watercourse much closer to the church than the modern straight channel. Apart from times of flood, the water in the Smite isn't deep, but it does flow throughout the year, so a modest-sized vessel would be able to navigate to the confluence with the Devon less than 2 miles north-east. The combined flow of the Devon and the Smite continues north towards Newark, and a marina is now situated on the opposite bank of the confluence, but this confluence was within the original extent of East Stoke, before the creation of Newark. Interestingly, the confluence is exactly where the Fossway crosses the Devon, so this suggests some sort of Roman inland port, taking advantage of the more accessible slopes of the banks of the Devon. Headwaters of the Devon are to the south of Nipton, close to Belvoir Castle. It flows roughly north to Stenwith, then to Muston, and then to Bottisford, with the eponymous ford still surviving. From there the Devon flows to Staunton in the Vale, before merging with the Smite about a mile to the northwest. Presumably, the Devon was navigable as far as the ford at Bottisford, because the Bottle was a high-status residence associated with trading excess produce and such like. So we can say that the locations of both Alston and Bottisford were determined by the then limits of navigation on the Smite and the Devon respectively, and a location suitable for fording these watercourses, which was also ideal for beaching the small vessels. The minster at Southwell is located less than half a mile to the west of the River Greet, and closer still to a minor watercourse called the Westhorpe Dumble. The Greet flows for another 2 miles before joining the Trent near Fiskerton. And the opposite side of the Trent is part of East Stoke parish. There is little doubt that the Greet would have been navigable to watercraft in the Anglo-Saxon period, and, given the location of the Roman villa adjacent to the minster, in preceding centuries too. So, of the 15 candidates for the earliest churches in Nottinghamshire, 5 are at the side of major rivers: Dunham, East Stoke, Misterton, Ratcliffe-on-Soar, and Stanford-on-Soar, and 6 are either at fords over navigable rivers or at the putative limits of navigation: Blythe, Clarborough, Edwinstowe, Mansfield, Austin, and Southwell. This leaves 4, Flawford, Kirkby and Ashfield, Vernameaton, and Wisel, which are remote from seemingly navigable watercourses. But all of these are adjacent to the county boundary, so maybe originated as some sort of boundary shrine, rather than the sort of minsters associated with extensive trade. If you're wondering why I've included Wisel, it's because the name was originally Weoho, the pagan shrine on a distinctive hill, and the parish church is on just such a hoe-shaped hill. Let me move on from watery locations and look at which early churches in Nottinghamshire might be successors to pre-conversion shrines. Now, at this stage, I'm going to put some cards on the table. Despite much popular myth that early churches are often successors to so-called pagan ritual sites, in reality, there is very little evidence of continuity of use from before to after the conversion to Christianity. So I'm not the sort of person who starts off by assuming that churches were once pagan shrines. But, as I steadily discovered, in Nottinghamshire that negative assumption needs serious reconsideration. Now, the available evidence suggests that many of Nottinghamshire's early churches could be successors to 3 types of pre-conversion shrine. Firstly, on boundaries, and presumably dedicated to the local tutelary guardian. The second category of pre-conversion shrines was adjacent to river crossings. These survive in such place names as Stapleford and Weeford. The shrine would allow travellers to ask intercessionary guardians for a safe crossing, or to give thanks for a safe crossing after they'd done it. In practice, some of the river crossings are also on the boundary of Nottinghamshire, so boundary shrines and river crossing shrines would effectively be combined. In Nottinghamshire, 7 of the 15 candidate earliest churches are adjacent to the county boundary: Dunham, Stamford-on-Soar, Kirkby and Ashfield, Misterton, Ratcliffe-on-Soar, Vernameaton, and Wisel. In addition, Blythe is close to but not on the boundary with South Yorkshire. Now, the third category of pre-conversion shrine is those adjacent to reliable sources of water. Now, for pragmatic reasons, all churches are likely to have been close to a reliable water source. Of Nottinghamshire's candidates, only Southwell is explicitly associated with a spring, although Vernameaton Church was located at a site that William Stukeley called the Wells. Before modern changes to the water table, Flawford Church must have had a spring, as it is remote from natural watercourses. And the use of such springs as early baptismal chapels is consistent with what we know about Christianity around the 7th and 8th centuries. Indeed, there's archaeological evidence of early Christian baptismal fonts reusing Roman cisterns made from lead, such as the one from Icklingham in Suffolk. This implies, doesn't prove, that Flawford, Kirkby and Ashfield, and Vernameaton might have originated as early baptismal chapels, rather than mother churches or minsters. So, in summary, my research has shed light on 3 broad aspects of the earliest churches in Nottinghamshire. Firstly, as with Leicestershire, there is some correlation with royal estate centres. However, I remain doubtful about this as a cause of the location of the earliest churches, and prefer to regard it simply as a helpful correlation. My second conclusion is, excluding candidate churches which were plausibly evolved from pre-conversion shrines, most earliest churches were located where waterborne trade was eminently possible. These 2 conclusions are somewhat as expected from my previous investigations of Leicestershire and Wiltshire, but the third conclusion is not one I expected. In summary, 11 of the 15 candidate early churches in Nottinghamshire, plus Stapleford on the Trent, fit into one or more of these 3 options for pre-conversion shrines. and that is not a conclusion I expected to be saying when I commenced this research. Two of the exceptions are Edwinstowe and Mansfield. Edwinstowe is explicitly a shrine of a different kind, commemorating the death of a revered king. Mansfield is too far from the source of the Mourne for this to be a baptismal chapel, and too low-lying to be a plausible boundary shrine. However, like Austin, it's located at the putative limits of navigation, implying an early trading place. And more significantly, Mansfield, as with Austin and the Dunham, are royal estate centres. I'm working on a PDF with many more details and all the bibliographical references for my sources of information. I hope this will appear fairly early in 2024. It'll be free to download. Check the description below for an update.